getting further away. Holding all my superstitions and my crazy suspicions of the people that I care about. I've been doing more screaming and I've been doing dreaming, and I think it's time I figured it out. Yeah, baby, you need a friend. Yeah, to understand, Lord, that life ain't only supply and demand.
Hello and welcome to another episode of ERG Power Talk. I'm your host, Joe Santana. That clip you just heard is from a song called Supply and Demand by Amos Lee. The lyrics of the song were written to provide a path out of burnout. And the singer's conclusion is always the same. Baby, I need a plan. And that is a huge focal point of our discussion for today. Planning to avoid burning yourself out as you strive for success. And I think that it's a super timely topic for all of you because burnout is on the rise, especially in the DEI space. In the April 15th, 2022 issue of Inc. magazine, there's an article that talks about this rising tide of chief diversity officer burnout. In fact, it points out how currently CDOs tend to drop out 2 years before their peers at similar position levels, due primarily to burnout. As volunteers with non-DEI day jobs who take on the additional weight of a leadership role over employee networks and resource groups, leaders of these groups are not faring any better. You, my friends, all need a plan. And our guest today is especially suited to help you tackle your planning and execution challenges. But before we introduce our guest, let's take a moment to review our mission and acknowledge our sponsors. This is ERG Power Talk, and I'm your host, Joe Santana. The purpose of ERG Power Talk is to provide a virtual forum for the exchange of great ideas and inspiration for ERG leaders, as well as others interested in supporting ERGs. No more waiting until the next conference and praying that you get the budget to travel to the conference in order to find great ideas and stimulation towards action. Just subscribe and listen at your convenience. Before we begin, a quick note of thanks to our supporters and sponsors. UL Solutions, CVS Health, Dollar General, Freighter Health and Wisconsin Medical College, Hiscox, Mass Mutual, McCormick, Tapestry, Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia, MIT Lincoln Laboratory, Elastic, Oshkosh Corporation, Peace Health, Pitney Bowes, Daimler Trucks North America, and Sony Pictures Entertainment. Now, let's go straight to the program. He's Vice President of Diversity and Inclusion with Western Governors University and the author of Diversity and Inclusion Matters, Tactics and Tools to Inspire Equity and Game-Changing Performance. His outstanding record of achievement spans across established businesses, startups, nonprofits, sports, and educational organizations.
I am Jason R. Thompson, and done diversity most of my career. Actually, probably one of the few people who can say my first job out of college was diversity in 1990, actually. So I've been doing this quite a long time. And, you know, a lot of my work now is more so, as you mentioned, it's the burnout. There's so much burnout, and it's more so trying to put in a plan to help avoid that and then set realistic expectations for your diversity work, because that's a huge challenge. Many times the outcomes they want are well beyond what you could actually achieve within a reasonable timeline. And so, you know, that's kind of who I am. I'm very practical and, you know, try to work in diversity in a way that creates outcomes, but also with a plan and a pace that you can hopefully stay in the space.
Thank you for joining us today, Jason. I enjoyed your book, and so I'm looking forward to having this discussion with you. Tell us a little more about that background. What led you to where you are in DEI today?
Yeah, you know, actually, my first job was in diversity, as I mentioned, but the interesting thing about it is there was a director for diversity at the University of Wyoming, and I had literally just flunked out. And somehow she found me, and I got myself back in. She took me under her wing and said, you know, I think you have some potential, and really started helping me. And that's how I always tell people, I'm just returning the favor. I mean, honestly, she saved me. My parents had not gone to college. They didn't know how to help me. And without her kind of intervention as being a mentor to me, and running that diversity office, which she did probably for the next literally 30 years. She just retired a couple of years ago. And a lot of people didn't realize, like University of Wyoming in 1990 literally had a diversity program even then. We actually technically do the same work we did then. It hasn't changed that much. But the book, the reason I wrote it is I think there's a lot of work out there that's very theoretical, but not practical. Like, what am I supposed to do on day one? Like, what data should I collect? Or we hear things like, oh, we should have CEO support. But many times, if you just launch a diversity program, the CEO has never seen a diversity program. They don't know how to support you. And none of the work tells you what to do and what that looks like. It just tells you need it. But many times it's like at certain events, maybe we need their visibility. So as an ERG, there's certain events where it'd be great for the CEO to show up and just be present. They don't have to lead the conversation or whatever, but just their visibility is important. And so the book just talks about that. Like, what are those spaces? And I'm very practical. So the book was an attempt to create, what are the practical steps? How do we plan? And when you build a diversity program, or if you have one that's struggling, what are some things you can be doing to try to get some outcomes and be effective?
It's funny when you were talking about practicality and about CEOs and asking them to be supporters of these efforts. I remember that myself, having come from the business and not being familiar with some of the practices that were going on within the space. When I first got involved with DEI decades ago, I was sitting in a meeting one time and someone mentioned, well, these executives here are champions of DEI. And I asked what at the time seemed like the most naive question, but I realized that it was an important question. And I did ask it out of my own naiveness. But the question was, so what do you guys do when you're like, what is it that I would physically see you doing that is championing? What does that look like? And there was this blank look in the room. And at first I wasn't sure if the blank look meant, well, don't you know? Aren't you clued in onto what this is? Later on, I came to realize it was more like, well, gee, we don't know exactly. We were asked to champion and we said, okay, we'll champion. But so that having that specificity, that clarity, that practicality that you're talking about is really important to driving these efforts. And as silly and funny as my story may sound, that does happen where we end up in situations where we are either tasked with doing things or we ask other people to engage, but there's no clarity as to exactly what that is from a practical standpoint. And to say that your book is practical is actually, to put it mildly. I found your book super practical, full of a lot of very direct, clear advice that could be followed by people to do specific things. And two things that you touched on in your book are the ADKAR and the CAPE model. Can you talk a little bit about each one of those? And we're going to explore those more later on, but just a general introduction as to what those are.
Yeah. So the CAPE model essentially is an acronym. So CAPE's an acronym for collect, analyze, plan, execute. Because what I found is most people would start with a diversity plan. And many times I was like, well, you don't even know what your problems are yet. You should collect the data first to figure out what your challenges are. So for example, we hear all the time, oh, we're doing a recruitment effort. And I was like, how do you know you have a recruitment problem? What data have you collected to know that recruitment's your challenge? It could be hiring bias. And those would be two separate solutions. So you need to collect the data first. And the analyzing of that helps you decide what the plan should be. And then you execute. And then the second piece of that, which I think is a very good question, is the point of diversity program is organizational change. And so then I started looking for what are the practical ways to do that. And it's already built. I mean, ADKAR is the one I use. I'm no expert on ADKAR, but ADKAR is another acronym. And what I found was because ADKAR is based in organizational change, the goal should be organizational change. Actually, that's what you want to do with diversity. So a lot of times with diversity, and I talk about this in the book pretty extensively, actually, like many times diversity training, people think is the outcome, and it's not. Like I always tell people, I can't make you racist in 45 minutes. Don't assume I can undo racism in 45 minutes, right? Like it takes people years to develop the biases they have, whether conscious or they know they have the bias. Regardless, it took a whole life to create those. And so by using the ADKAR model, I just started setting a realistic expectation that really a lot of times your diversity training is the A in ADKAR, which is the awareness, right? We need people to be aware that we even have a diversity program, right? What am I supposed to do? So even if they don't attend, the fact that you're always messaging, hey, we're doing training this month or whatever it is, tells employees you didn't attend, like this must be important because you do it on a regular basis. Like I know when I work at McDonald's, what's important, we make hamburgers every day. I know that's a priority. So it's kind of the same logic. Like just fundamentally, the A in ADKAR is that awareness. So you need to get the awareness out so people know. And then, we can go through all the parts of the acronym, but the thing, if you think about it, next piece is, you have to have that knowledge, you have to have the repetition and all those different pieces. When you start aligning your diversity program around that, it sets a realistic expectation for what diversity training can actually do. It's just like calculus. You don't learn calculus in the first day in the first 45 minutes. You actually have to go on a regular basis. And when you do that, you actually will learn calculus and how to apply it. What do we want to do with diversity? We want you to learn the concepts, right? The D is for desire. So you get the desire, I'm going to attend. I attend, I get the knowledge, then I can apply it. And the repetition helps me on a regular basis because these are complicated concepts. And so that's how I combined CAPE with ADKAR in order to get outcomes and a plan that you can actually manage and run from whether you're a diversity officer or even leading an ERG.
So you mentioned what the A stands for and the D. What's the rest of the ADKAR acronym? Yeah.
So D, I want to say is for development. Like I said, I'm no expert on it. I always get these confused, but now I remember what they are. So A is for the awareness, right? So that's the first thing in ADKAR. D is for desire. And this is important because the reason you want to regularly message out why you're doing these diversity trainings is it gives people the awareness, but hope they'll go, you know what? We do this all the time. I probably should go, right? Start planting the seed of I should probably attend. That's the desire piece. The K in ADKAR is for knowledge. So if I attend, that's where I get the knowledge. And by attending and participating, I get the A, which is the ability to actually apply the learnings that I got. So one of my examples is microaggressions. We teach that, but they're complicated because in one context, I can ask you where you're from. And if somebody asks me as a person of color, African-American, I'll go, well, I'm from Wyoming. No big deal, right? But for many of my friends who are Asian, they're like, yeah, they'll ask me the first time where I'm from. And I'll say San Diego. Then they ask me again, no, where are you from? And I'll say San Diego, born and raised. And they'll ask me a third time and they know, like, they really want to know what kind of Asian I am. They want to know, am I Chinese? Am I Korean? And so the fact you get this question, 20 times a day, 3 different ways, and it becomes a microaggression. But the context is important. Like, why can I ask a Black person who's a person of color and it's not offensive? But when I ask an Asian person, right, it's complicated. And so that's why it's important that we have the reinforcement, which was the R in ADKAR, is because that repetition helps us. Just like you go to calculus every day to learn complicated concepts. What's interesting is in one context, it's a microaggression. In another, same exact question is not a microaggression. And so I can see why people struggle with this and why if we only gave them 45 minutes where I teach you unconscious bias, microaggression, privilege, and all these terms and try to squeeze all that into 45 minutes, why it doesn't work and we don't get very good outcomes is because it's too many concepts, it's too complicated. And we've created no space for you to actually practice. In any other learning concept, we would give you a space where you would practice the concept. And so that's what I've moved diversity towards in the training and the programs is creating space for people to practice the concept. And a lot of it's based in ADKAR, right? It's the whole idea of create the awareness, create the desire. People get the knowledge and the ability. And the reinforcement is there's a space for me to practice the concept.
That's excellent. And you mentioned also that CAPE fits in there. Tell us a little more about CAPE.
Yeah. So I will give an example. I actually recently met with a client, and one of the things they said to me is, they already had a diversity council when I got here. They hired me as a chief diversity officer. They had written a plan, and fundamental to the plan was recruitment. So I'm just doing the recruitment stuff they asked. And I was like, well, how do you know you even have a recruitment problem? And she said, oh, I hadn't thought about that. And I said, well, you need to collect your data first. That's the C in CAPE, is collect the data. And the reason you do, what you want to know is many times that organization is not diverse. Like everybody can see that. We're not very diverse. But if you don't collect the data, you don't know, are we not diverse because no one's applying for our jobs? We don't have very much diversity in the recruitment pool? Or is it they're applying for the jobs and they're never being hired? And if they're not being hired, you have selection bias. So by separating that data and understand it, you go, okay, the reason we do unconscious bias training is because people are applying but never being hired. Those are two separate things, right? So that's why you would create a recruitment plan, is because I would know no one's applying for our jobs. That's a different strategy. Mm-hmm. And and the solution lives in a different place too, right? Because unconscious bias is hiring managers. They have no control of who's applying for jobs. That's actually more of an HR responsibility. The HR needs to be more active in putting people in the pool. So that's why I always say collect the data so you know where your actual problems are. And you can see I'm already eased into the A of CAPE, which is the analyzing, right? You analyze that data. Then you develop a plan. So that way you know if the plan's working or not. Because This is the other reason I wrote the book. People had tons of frustration around, I've been running the program for 2 years, nothing's happening. And it's usually because you didn't collect the data, you didn't analyze it, and you have a plan that's disconnected to the actual problem. So many times, this is another thing I see all the time, and I talk about this in the book too. You'll say, oh, if you're committed to diversity, we should see diversity in your leadership team. That's true. But the thing is, that's usually typically the lowest amount of turnover. If you think about it, if you have high turnover at the VP level, something in your company is seriously broke. Generally, you want that around 10% is all the turnover you want in your leadership team. And that's probably too much, right? And so it rarely turns over quickly. But most people build a whole plan around that. Oh, we're going to diversify our leadership team. And it never happens, or it happens very slowly, which it should happen slowly because you want low turnover. The job of your CEO, her job is to keep good people. And if she's good at it, nobody leaves. If nobody leaves, you can't get turnover. So if you set this goal, you set a goal that's unachievable. You're 2 years in, it feels like failure. And everybody's looking like, why aren't we more diverse? And I always tell people, because you get it from leadership teams even. I was like, well, who's leaving? I'll go to an executive, training, and the whole leadership team of the company's there. And I was like, well, I need somebody to leave. If you want me to achieve this, who's going to be first out the door? Because if some of you don't leave, we can't become more diverse. Like, people don't understand that equation. And that's where this CAPE technique comes from. We actually have a small startup called CAPE Inclusion, and we help people understand data. And that's what we do, is because many times people will set a goal that's not achievable. And then that's why we have high burnout. And this is, even where you started the conversation about why it's important to have a good plan. That plan should be built in something like CAPE, where you have a technique that you've used, right? I've collected my data. I've analyzed it. My plan is built on it. I can execute based on it because I know I put everything in the right order. Most diversity work does the opposite. They start with the plan, then maybe they collect the data, then they analyze it, and then they've been executing the whole time and the whole thing's disconnected, doesn't work. And that's why I came up with CAPE and layered that on ADKAR. So, because that's the execution of the day-to-day, is the ADKAR, the organizational change. But the CAPE is what we use to start, so you can build a good foundation for your diversity program.
Got it. Elegant, straightforward. It's fantastic. Mm-hmm. One of the things that you talk about in your book as well is you talk about how CDOs and ERGs can partner. First of all, at the very beginning of that is really understanding the role of the CDO, what it is and what it is not. Because in a lot of organizations, there's this belief when the CDO comes in that this is the herald of a big change that's just going to happen by the presence of this person. And a lot of people that are in employee resource groups obviously look to that person as someone who's going to help them to drive forward various community agendas. And of course, there are differences between what CDOs do from company to company. But in your research and based on just your own experience as well, what are some of the general abilities and limits of CDOs?
Yeah. And I talk about this a lot in the book. One of the major tools for a CDO is literally influence. Because at the end of the day, you're held accountable for all the hiring, although you don't make the hiring decisions. If you think about it, those hiring decisions are made in different departments every day on a regular basis by a lot of different managers. In some cases, you might even know in a big company. I mean, honestly, I'm in a company right now, 8,500. I don't have every hiring manager. I don't know them. All I can do is influence those decisions. And that's where ERGs and CDOs really have the most power, is how do we influence the organization? And when you create visibility, like ERGs are doing events on a regular basis, a lot of times they have a sense of frustration because they're like, well, we want the organization to change right away. And it's like, no, it doesn't actually work that way. If you think about it, influence takes time and it takes momentum. And so you have to work cooperatively to create this momentum of, okay, we are doing Heritage Months and we try to make sure there's some visibility there. We bring in different speakers. These are powerful things. And many times ERGs, I don't think, realize that, because what it does is this is the awareness. And that's why I think it's so important to understand ADKAR and apply it, because if ERGs start using that, they realize, oh, what we're doing is creating this awareness and desire. And if they attend our events, they get the knowledge. But if you start putting in that way, you start pacing yourself in a way you realize this is how we're going to create outcomes. And then it becomes more cooperative between the CDO and the ERGs, because now we're aligned and we're setting a pace that we can actually achieve against. Because usually what happens is people set a goal that's just unachievable because they haven't done the math either. Like and I talk about this in the book too. Like I had the head of HR years ago came to me and said, hey, Jason, we should be 30% diverse in 3 years. It's mathematically impossible. I just put out a spreadsheet and showed her, and we can't get there. Why? We don't have enough turnover. And nobody wants high turnover. So unless you're suggesting we increase turnover, literally we need to triple it, we're not going to get to that number, right? But what we can do is identify where the challenges are in the organization and influence those hires. And so we put in a strategy that literally said, when it's director and above, because that's where we saw the least amount of diversity, we had a very direct plan that we would put in about you had to have 4 candidates, 2 of which are people of color or women. And there's an interesting research that was done. It's published in the Harvard Business Review. And I believe the title is something to the effect of, if there's only one woman, the odds of you hiring is 0. But what they found in the research, if you just get gender balance, 2 men and 2 women, the odds of hiring women is 50%, which is what it should be. And so we just used some slight little changes like that in the hiring process, specifically for directors and above. We got outcomes. But I also could justify doing it because I had data. I collected data and said, well, this is where we see the least amount of promotions, least amount of people of color, least amount of women. So let's do some very targeted strategies around those hires. The rest of hires in the organization were relatively normal. We were getting the kind of outcomes we thought we'd get. But because it was so tailored, people were like, okay, I can understand this. I know why I'm supposed to be doing this. There was little resistance to it because the data showed it. And then I had outcomes. I could say, even though we only had 2 hires, at least half of them were women or people of color, which is where we'd hope to be, right? Or if you made 4 hires, right, or whatever it might be, you could start showing the numbers actually look like where we should be. And that's what's so important. And that's how, if everyone's aligned around even this ADKAR model, we're creating the awareness. By creating the awareness, people can therefore understand why we put in this particular plan, right? That's how you get that momentum and energy around your diversity program.
Got it. That's great. So we've talked about the CAPE model as something that CDOs can use, but clearly employee resource groups can use the CAPE model as well. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think a lot of times with ERGs, the reason I think the CAPE model works is if you can collect the data of like looking around, we don't see a lot of diversity in the leadership team, but we can understand there's a pace. They can become more active in the sense of, oh, this position becomes available. It's direct. We make sure our network is active, right? We make sure our members are applying for those positions. We try to make sure our members external, they're being contacted, and we're trying to identify candidates. This is how we begin to align based on that. Like we have an action, but it's based on data that we know will help us actually create an outcome, but also realistically. And the plan gets us that, and we can execute. So I do think that's why, it's kind of a simple technique. It sounds like blatantly apparent, but I think just by, resetting our diversity work around that, it really helps us, I think, reduce the frustration. And that's how you open the show, right? Like when you have a plan, it reduces stress, it reduces the frustration with it, because you can realize like sometimes it may look slow, but we have a plan. We understand what we're trying to get to. There's only so much influence you can have over who's hired in leadership positions. But another thing that makes it really helpful is you also know, what, they made 3 hires at the VP level and above, and they hired no women. I can point that out. That's very tangible. If you just say, oh, we need more diversity in the leadership team, of course we do. I can't agree or disagree with that, right? That's just a statement. But if you say, look, you had 3 opportunities to hire and you didn't hire one person of color, or you never hired a woman, and we have no diversity, people go, okay, now I know what I'm being held accountable to, right? It makes sense. All right. We think 1 of 3 should be a person of color, or should be a woman. That, just the data tells us this. It becomes reasonable, and everybody knows what they're being held accountable to.
And that clarity in terms of what are the roles that people can play, like what is the scope of what a CDO can and cannot do? What is the part that an ERG can and cannot play within that effort? And what is the focus of this based on data? That clarity automatically does a lot to reduce stress. Okay, so let's pause here and take stock of what we've learned from this first half of our discussion with Jason. 1, to succeed as an ERG leader, you need to approach your efforts from a practical standpoint. 2, to address challenges from a practical standpoint, you need clarity around your community and organization's challenges. 3, to get that clarity, you need data. 4, the first step you can take to ensure that you're operating from a place of practicality is to put Jason's CAPE model to work. The 4-letter acronym CAPE, C-A-P-E, stands for C, collect the data. Find out where the organization and community have challenges and opportunities. Next, A, analyze the data to determine the root causes of the challenges and opportunities. So, for example, if you find that you don't hire enough women into a particular role, you want to dig deeper and find out if it's because women aren't applying for that role or because they aren't being selected for the role. One of those challenges calls for increasing your attraction, while the other one calls for addressing internal obstacles such as biases that are preventing the hiring of qualified female candidates. After you've analyzed the data and identified the root causes of opportunities and challenges, now you're in position to go to step P, which stands for putting together a plan. And once you have that solid plan built on data that has been thoroughly analyzed, you're ready to move on to step E in CAPE, which is to execute. 5, to help you to execute, you can employ a model like ADKAR, A-D-K-A-R. Following the 5 steps in the ADKAR model, you will A, build awareness, D, motivate desire, K, provide knowledge, which imparts, A, which is the ability to change, and finally R, use reinforcement to keep building momentum towards your change goal. And finally, 6, the most effective way to drive the change you want is to work with the CDO to increase your collective influence over the decisions that are being made by hiring managers and business managers. By starting, having, and tracking a practical plan and setting a pace with your CDO that is reasonable and achievable, you avoid the frustration and stress of expecting too much, too fast, or becoming a solution, chasing a non-existent or wrong problem. In the next segment of our discussion with Jason, we will continue our exploration of these topics and continue to explore the power of collecting data and executing practical plans. We're also going to look at the power of some of the simplest things that your ERGs can do to create upward mobility for all of your members. All of this and more when we come back, but first, this. I'll see you on the other side. Are you feeling overwhelmed by your DEI and ERG community work? Are you at a loss as to where to start or how to measure success? Then get the book Diversity and Inclusion Matters, Tactics and Tools to Inspire Equity and Game-Changing Performance by Jason R. Thompson. Jason is a no-nonsense experienced DEI executive who quickly bypasses all the complexity and gives you easy-to-follow, actionable steps on where to start and how to measure your progress. His book is loaded with easy-to-understand stories and practical tips. I say it's a must-have for any professional looking to end the chaos as they strive toward creating a more diverse, equitable, and inclusive workplace. Get Diversity and Inclusion Matters today. Order your copy at Amazon.com and also follow Jason on LinkedIn. Let me ask you this. Let's say that you have a Black ERG and clearly, they're being asked to help recruit candidates, but they don't have any data in terms of how they can help or what they can do. It goes back to that lack of clarity that you were talking about. What are some of the things that you see that work?
Yeah, one of the things I think is undervalued that happens. And I think the reason is it's undervalued is because many times it's like my network is invisible. Who's in my network is invisible. But we know you get jobs based on who's in your network. And so for many ERGs, they often think of, well, we don't have enough diversity and leadership teams, so let's do a mentorship development program. And I was like, no, actually, that almost reinforces a stereotype that people of color aren't prepared. What you can be doing is networking events where senior leaders have an opportunity to engage with your members in ways that are somewhat informal. And the importance of that, if you think about it, the informal network, which typically isn't explicit in organizations, is actually how you get your promotions and some of the better jobs. I mean, there's tons of data that shows it, right? The best jobs come out of your network. So I always say you have to make implicit explicit. You should create opportunities for the network that you have to include the leadership team and to make sure the leadership team's network is diverse. And many times, and I think it's hard And a little disappointing because a lot of times the work of ERGs is kind of belittled. Oh, you're just having meetings. And it's like, no, actually, that's where a lot of work gets done. We always hear a lot of jobs and work gets done at the golf course, right? Generally, as people of color, we've not been included in that. So what you have to do is explicitly create those spaces where you can say, no, we try to network with our leaders. We invite them to our meetings. And a lot of it is that casual conversation where you're now seen as a peer. You're now seen with somebody who has a unique skill set. And hopefully what begins to happen, and this is the part that's kind of really hard to measure, is that because you're in the network, when a position becomes available, I think, oh, wait, I remember I met, John or I met Joe at this event, and I think they would be great for this next VP job. Right. But otherwise, like if we don't, and now that we're even more remote, it's even harder because I'm never going to pass you in the hallway. I'm not going to get in the elevator with you. I won't see. So it's hard for me to develop those relationships with leaders. And so one of the things we've been doing is being very explicit about that and encouraging that kind of thing where you invite them to present about their career, even if it's just informal, or they invite them to your meetings. You create networking spaces because you need to be explicit about creating a space where you can be seen as a peer and your expertise can be shown. And not always in the and this is, I'm not saying mentorship programs are bad. And I've talked about this in the book though, but they do feed a stereotype that you're never ready as a woman or as a person of color, right? That somehow you had to be mentored. When in fact it's no, actually we're peers. I have expertise. I'm ready for this position. If I were in your network, you would think of me. And I always use the example of look at the two head coaches for the Super Bowl, right? Both of them, first time they ever been head coaches. Neither one were in a mentorship or a pipeline program, mid-30s, and their head coach of football. They were hired on potential and because they were in a network where they could be seen. That's the, network that we need to make sure we're putting ourselves into so we can create these opportunities so that you're given an opportunity based on your potential so that you can show that you could achieve at a very high level, because it shouldn't be held against you that you haven't done the job before. But I'm concerned that if we continue to use, pipeline programs, is that, well, you haven't finished the pipeline program, so I'm not going to afford you this opportunity yet. The main time it's almost held against you at times. And what we need to say is, no, I'm in your network. We network. You've seen what I can do. Give me my opportunity and I'll show you I can knock this out of the park.
That's great. I've actually seen that work miracles, literally. There was a short-term program where the mentee would go and spend time with a mentor for a period of, let's say, a week or two. The mentee would sit in non-confidential meetings with this mentor, meet some of their direct reports. And the results of that were that when opportunities came up for that senior executive, they remembered that person, or some of the people in their staff remembered that person. And that was such a simple thing to do. It was really low cost because it only involved a little bit of travel and lodging if it involved sending the person to one of the other locations. But other than that, it was just scheduling and maybe a little bit of time away from their day job, spending time with this mentor. But the amount of movement that created in terms of opportunity for people that were underrepresented was actually pretty exciting. I mean, it was just amazing. And all that was done was putting people in situations where they could get to know each other. That was it. There's nothing more magical than that.
And that's such a good point. And I think that's the thing. Many times the work that ERGs do is somewhat belittled. Like we're just meeting and get together. And actually, that's where a lot of very powerful work happens because it allows us to build our network, right? And create opportunities. And so a lot of the ERG work is very powerful. And we need to make sure organizations understand that just because you can't measure every single thing, these interactions are very important. And that's how a lot of work gets done within organizations.
Absolutely. And when we were talking about the need for specificity and clarity in order to not only reduce stress, but to galvanize people to action. I remember a couple of years ago, there were a number of ERG groups that really wanted to help the organization with recruiting, but didn't really know how, short of attending maybe a recruiting event and sitting in and talking to people. There was nothing else that presented itself as an opportunity for them to do that. And then they were exposed to data that let them know where there were job openings in the organization. And it was scrub data that only contained things like the title of the job, what kind of general experience it needed, and who the recruiter was that was looking for that particular job. So salary information, direct manager, all that other stuff that was more confidential was scrubbed out. But in any event, that data was made available to these various communities, and the number of people that they found to fill the pipeline from within their external networks was absolutely amazing. But what the most important critical thing for them to be able to do that is they had to have clarity. They had to know, what are you looking for? Where are you looking for it? What kind of job is it? And what location? And once that information was supplied, as opposed to just saying, can you help us with recruitment, that general, very high level, foggy label, once it was made more specific, we need XYZ, we need some in California, we need another group over here in New York City, we need another group. Now they were able to act on that, and they were able to take action. So one of the things I always put out there to people is either A, if you're in the position to supply information, be as clear as possible about what it is that you're looking for. Or B, if you're one of these community groups and you're looking to help, ask questions to get that level of clarity so that you know exactly what you're looking for. One of the things that you bring up in your book when it comes to setting goals and understanding how to make sure that those goals can be executed is competing values. And you talked a little bit about that earlier. And one of the competing values that you presented is we want low turnover on one end. And then you got another goal over here that says we want to increase our diversity through hiring. Well, those two things are not reconcilable, right? You're either going to be really good at one and you're going to fail at the other. What are some other areas where you see that there might be competing values that community leaders and DEI leaders should be aware of, so that when they are signing up for goals or signing up to support goals in their respective roles, they do so with clarity and that they're able to negotiate more reasonable and achievable targets, as opposed to, use your example earlier, trying to increase the number of underrepresented people by 30% while at the same time maintaining a 10% or lower turnover rate.
Yeah, that's a good point. And one of the things within the CAPE technique and in the book, and like I said, we have a small startup called CAPE Inclusion. What we do is help people understand those levers, because a lot of times what happens is there's only so many promotions that can actually happen in a year. So what you want to know is, do we have equity in our promotions? Is the probability of people of color being promoted equivalent to their white peers? Or is the probability of you being terminated equivalent to your male peers if you're a woman, or LGBTQ, or a person with disabilities? And so many times I always tell people that's what equity means. It doesn't mean everyone's equally fired. It means it's equitable in the sense that the probability of you being fired is the same. Annual reviews are another good place. And there's a competing interest with the annual reviews, because many times annual reviews are tied to a limited budget. And so what happens is, and I see this all the time, right? We only have so much budget, so only so many people can be rated very highly. And because of that, we start pushing people's annual rating down because there's only so much money for everybody. And then it becomes unfair, because what happens is you try to force everybody into this normal bell curve because we only have so much money. And it takes some people and it pushes them down just because we don't have enough money to pay them if everybody was in the top category. And so what we find, though, is many times women and people of color are typically more harshly impacted by that process, because their annual reviews typically are lower than their peers. So it's important. That's another thing that should be looked at, is when we do these annual reviews and we look at ratings, how are people being rated? And is that equitable? Do we see some of these same patterns? And we have this kind of thing where we want people to be high performers, but we only have so much money to give them. And really those things should be separated so that it's fair to them. You shouldn't be limited. Like, how many people can be the top performer? We don't take from each other. Like, me being a top performer in marketing takes nothing from a top performer in accounting. But the way we created it is there can only be so many top performers somehow. And is actually, we don't take from each other. You can be the best marketing person in the world. That takes nothing from people in accounting, but we do it as somehow there's some kind of limit here, and there should not be. But typically it's something that's disconnected, which is the amount of money we have to give out. So we start limiting these things, or we force it into a bell curve. These things typically have unintended consequences where people of color and women are disproportionately impacted by that. Another thing that I think people often don't think about is diversity on your website. Like, everybody thinks diversity on the website is important, But what I find many times, they have overrepresentation. There's literally too many people of color. And so when you're trying to recruit, people of color look at your website and they see, well, you have so many people of color. This isn't even believable to me anymore. I don't believe you're actually committed to diversity because there's actually too many people of color. I know your company doesn't look like that, right? And so there has to be that right balance. And because I've actually had to deal with this recently. And so it's the reality of you should have diversity on your website, but it should be balanced with the reality of what your company actually looks like. And in some cases, yeah, it should be aspirational. We'd like to be more diverse. That makes sense for many companies. Maybe you're not as diverse as you'd like to be, but there is a balance where you could actually have so much diversity that it's no longer believable. And many times I think we forget, like for many women and people of color, we go to your website and that's what we're looking for. Like, is this believable? Is there any diversity? If there's none, that tells me something, but it could actually be too much. That tells me something too. And so that's, again, another place where balance is important, that you have to, message. And that's where ERGs can be really helpful. They can say, look, I get this diversity goal, but come on, let's be honest. We don't look like that. Like you got to tone this down a little bit. So.
Gotcha. It's interesting as you were talking about that. So clearly there are some of these competing values that we were talking about that are basically, for example, if you're going to have 10% turnover, you can't have 30% change in the demographics of the population to change it to become more balanced in terms of having more underrepresented people. But some competing values can sometimes be that the organization doesn't realize that in the things the organization thinks are important, it may have created conditions where certain changes are resisted by those values. So, for example, if everybody has to be force ranked into a bell curve because we only have so much money to go around, how are we going to then make that system more equitable in terms of representing the true skill and abilities of the people that we have there? And also, if because of past choices that were made or preferences, there is a certain group of people who always end up at the top of that bell curve, then clearly there are going to be some other people that are going to end up on the downward side of that. And given the way that organizations are structured today, it's very highly likely they're going to be underrepresented people that are going to end up on the other side of that bell curve. So that is a competing value that has to do with the values that the organization has, maybe even values that they're not totally conscious of. They're not thinking of the fact that these two things conflict with each other, but they do. They do conflict with each other.
Exactly.
And I'm sure that there's probably more of those invisible value conflicts than even the more visible ones that we talked about before, because that goes back to our biases and how we try to reconcile things in our mind.
And I think that's a good point. And that's why I think ADKAR is so important, is the repetition, that I should be introduced to concepts like unconscious bias on a regular basis, so I can apply that learning to how we do our annual reviews and start thinking about, oh, now look at my annual reviews. There must be some form of bias going on here I didn't realize, because women are always rated lower than their male counterparts. We have a disproportionate number of men always ranked at the highest part of it. And a lot of times people don't make that connection. Okay, what am I doing? And in this evaluation process, because another thing we do, and we do this all the time, actually, we evaluate time to your commitment to how hard you work. So it could be that you come in an hour early, you stay an hour late, and that's valued, even though doesn't have anything to do with how much you produce. And many times we find disproportionately people who are caregivers for their own children don't have that extra time to give, but it's held against them because they're not putting in that extra hour in the morning, extra hour, disproportionately impacting women, but it has nothing to do with what they're producing. We're actually just measuring how much time you sit behind your desk rather than what are you producing? Because it could be that you're just very efficient, because I have kids at home that I take care of. I got to get them to daycare. I pick them up from daycare, but we are inadvertently applying a bias of time to performance that disproportionately impacts women. So you can see, right, if I'm not introduced to concepts of unconscious bias on a regular basis, I typically don't make those connections. I don't see how I might be applying something in one context to another that is disproportionately impacting certain communities and not others. And so I think it's important to have repetition so that people can apply the concepts.
That's a great example. That's one of those invisible personal preference values that's knocking up against what we are saying that we're trying to achieve as a community or as an organization in our efforts. So there's one more thing I wanted to touch on. It's a little bit of a shift in topic, but there's one more thing that you talked about in your book that I thought was really interesting. You did it kind of in a humorous way, but many are new, even existing ERGs today. They get stuck when it comes to naming themselves. For example, shall we call ourselves the differently abled ERG or the disability ERG? And you spent a little bit of time talking about naming things in your book. What's your advice if someone's starting a new community or group and they're looking for a name and they get into a meeting and you've got one person saying, well, we should call ourselves the female professionals as opposed to the women's group? I like that word better. Yeah. What is your advice there?
Well, I'm kind of the opinion you can do all the above, right? In some cases, if you need a longer name, you need a longer name. But my example, I always tell people, don't ask me to organize the Davids. And what I mean by that is some people go by Dave, some people go by David. And if I said to you, well, it's so complicated for me, I'm going to organize every Dave and David in the world, and we're going to have a conference and a summit, and they're going to have to choose. Either it's Dave or David. They can't have both. Like, that would be ridiculous. No one would say that. But we typically look at communities of color and women and say this to us, right? Like, is it African-American or Black? You got to choose one. I'm like, why? Some people want to be called Black. Some people want to call African-American. Some people are Tim. Some people are Timmy, right? That's your right. Individually, we have a right to choose who we are. That's actually what equity and diversity looks like. It means our names might change. They evolve. We use pronouns more now than we ever did, and a person can choose their pronouns and it may change. And that is completely normal. And I think many times we put way too much energy on trying to force people into these boxes instead of saying, no, actually diversity means I might have a different pronoun today than I did yesterday. That's normal. I have a friend who recently said, well, just call me Liz. I thought I was going to use Elizabeth. It never works. Just call, that's all right. Like, and the thing is, we fundamentally know how to do that. Like, all of us have friends who go, oh, that's Dave. Don't call him Davey. He gets real upset. Like, people we even coach each other on it. We do this naturally. What I'm asking of you is not actually unique. You typically already do this in your life. The people, whether it's your spouse or your cousin or the guy two blocks down the street. Don't call him Frankie. He goes by Frank, right? We know this, right? And that's how it works. And we already do this. It's the same courtesy that we're asking you to afford everyone in their community and their identities.
And if you happen to be the leader of the group and you want to call it one thing, that's great. And the next leader comes up and they can have a name change if they feel more comfortable with another name. Absolutely. Yeah. That's great. By the way, I think that one of the things that stands out by all of the responses that you give is practical. Yeah. You said that earlier, but I think we've got to put that in big caps or a neon sign and just shine it above you. Super practical. So what resources, Jason, do you recommend that resource group leaders use to prepare themselves to become better partners with CDOs in their efforts to meet the needs of their communities?
Yeah, I think one of the things, this is, of course, I'm super practical. I always say realistic expectations. Like, you really have to work together to set realistic expectations, because many times people set these goals that really aren't achievable, especially in the timetable they've set. And so if you set realistic expectations, and these things can be very impactful. Like, I think a lot of times we really belittle meetings and speakers when in fact they're part of this ad card model of raising awareness, right? The more we have this conversation, the more people can practice the concept, the more they're apt to apply those concepts. And it takes that repetition and realizing organizational change takes a little while, like to turn the ship, as I say, it takes a little while to turn the ship and it's going to take a minute. But if we can work cooperatively and understand that and set realistic expectations, we're actually going to achieve against it. Because many times what they want you to fix, you can't fix in the timetable. And I understand the urgency, but it also takes a certain amount of reality. And I'm not saying take away the urgency. I'm just saying, look, let's at least get on the same page with the pace here and what it's going to take.
Great advice. Mm-hmm. So how can our listeners reach you, Jason?
So obviously there's CAPE-Inclusion.com. You can just go to that website. You can see kind of the CAPE techniques there. Again, we're a small kind of consultancy, so we obviously can be supportive to that. We have the book, Diversity Inclusion Matters. You can pick that up on Amazon even. I encourage you to hopefully purchase from your local booksellers as well and support them. I always think that's important, that we can do that. But those are two easy ways. And of course, jason@capeinclusion.com, simple way to email me. Happy to respond. Happy to connect on LinkedIn as well.
That's fantastic. And I can attest to the fact the book is super duper practical. So Jason, it's been a pleasure. Thank you again for joining us today.
Thanks, Joe. Enjoyed it.
So let's look at what we got out of this second half of our discussion with Jason. 1, as Jason concluded, the most important thing is to create realistic expectations and plans. 2, as noted throughout this interview, having data is vital, and keeping on top of data will remain vital as you execute your ERG plan. So make sure you stay in the data loop with your CDO so that you can continue to sharpen your efforts. 3, as you create plans and drive efforts forward, make sure that you're aware of competing values. Competing values, for example, are when you sign up to increase women in leadership by 30%, when your HR department is striving to keep leadership turnover under 10% in a company that is not adding leadership slots. 4, closely examine these data forces that'll help you to see and address competing values in your organization. 5, one of the most powerful things you can do to help your members find opportunities to move up in the organization is to provide spaces for leaders to connect to your members. 6, creating these spaces for leaders to connect with your members is even more important in today's distributed workforce, so look for ways to do it virtually. And finally, 7, remember that most of your most powerful work happens when you simply connect people. In concluding, I think we can best capture most of Jason's message in an old story I read a short while ago that goes like this. Once upon a time, in a far-off land, there was a young princess named Henrietta. Henrietta was the youngest of 3 sisters, and although she was the least experienced, she was also the most passionate and ambitious. She longed to prove herself and perhaps be chosen to become the ruler of her father's kingdom. One day, Henrietta's father, the old king, called her into his chamber and told her that he had a special mission for her. The kingdom was under threat from a neighboring kingdom, and Henrietta was to lead an army to defend their lands. Henrietta was thrilled at the prospect of leading her own army, but she quickly realized that she had no idea how to plan a military campaign. She had never been to a war before, let alone led an army. Panicked, Henrietta confided in her older sisters, who laughed at her and told her that she was not ready for such a responsibility. But Henrietta was determined to prove herself, so she set about gathering as much information as she could about the enemy kingdom and their military tactics. She spent many long hours in the library, studying maps and military strategy, and she even consulted with the kingdom's most experienced generals. Slowly but surely, Henrietta began to develop a solid database plan for how to defend her kingdom. On the day of the battle, Henrietta's army faced off against the enemy, and thanks to her data collection and careful planning, they emerged victorious. Henrietta's father was proud of her, and the people of the kingdom celebrated her victory. From that day on, Henrietta became known as a wise and capable leader, and when chosen to become the queen, she ruled the kingdom with honor and distinction. And she learned the importance of data collection and planning, a lesson that would serve her well throughout her life. Like Henrietta, you don't need to have a vast amount of experience to launch your successful campaign as an ERG leader. What you need is to collect the right data, analyze it, and formulate and execute a well-designed plan. If you do that, not only will your ERG efforts succeed, but like Henrietta, you'll develop a skill set that will serve you well throughout your entire life. I urge you to start building your data collection, planning, and execution muscles today. Thank you for tuning in to ERG Power Talk. If you enjoyed and got value out of this program, please like us and leave a favorable review at your podcast provider's site. Also, invite others to listen to the show. By the way, contact me if you're looking for an ERG Symposium keynote or a leader for your strategy workshop, new chair onboarding, and or ERG bootcamp. I can run these for you either in person or in a virtual setting. Also, for more great ideas and tips for your ERGs, get my books, Supercharge Your ERGs, 18 Tips to Power Up Your ERG/BRG Strategy, and the new DEI and ERG Frontier, how you and your efforts can rise and thrive in the new world of constant disruption. Both available on Amazon.com. I'm Joe Santana. Thanks again for tuning in.